My name is John Marion. That's a good microphone, isn't it? From Common Cause. And if this is your first event with us, thank you. If you're a frequent flyer, thanks for coming back. I wanted to start. I'm supposed to announce, it says here, where the emergency exits are. So I assume the green lighted sign, and then there's one over here. There's bathrooms outside past the registration desk. And I guess that's all they want me to announce. So before we get started, and I introduce the panelists, I just want to thank a couple of people. RISD, this is our fourth event in this auditorium, fifth event. And they actually give this to us as a donation, so we're appreciative that RISD gives us the space. In particular, their Vice President for Government Relations, Babette Alina, and Pamela Kimmel, who runs programming here in the auditorium. So thank you to them. And they can't hear me, but I wanted to thank Christina Mora and Sean Selleck, who are helping out at the registration desk. And then I want to thank the panelists for taking a Saturday morning to share their wisdom with us and their insights. This is the second panel in a program we're calling Demystifying Democracy. The idea is to explain the legislative process in Rhode Island so that you can get involved in the legislative process in Rhode Island. So the first panel in January was kind of an overview. And if you missed that, you can see it online. We have the video up online. And the video from this will go online next week. The next event is on May 5th, and that's going to be just about the state budget process, because the state budget is the most important thing that the General Assembly does every year, and so it was worth having an event just to explain the state budget process. So hopefully you can join us on May 5th. I want to point out that you received some handouts when you came in. If you didn't, you can get them at the desk. These are also online, and this is what we're calling a toolkit to help you if you ever want to go and testify at the General Assembly, to give you some guidance, right? So there's a glossary of terms that hopefully can explain some of the weird terminology that's used up there. There's a nice timeline of when to show up and when things might happen. There's a map that shows all the hearing rooms. To the best of my knowledge, it's the only map that exists of the State House. The story I have is there was an employee of the executive branch who came to this event. I didn't know she was here, and then I had to go into her office, and she had the map up at her desk, because apparently people pop their head in and say, I can't find this room. And she said she'd worked there for years, and this is the only map she'd ever seen. There's some information about how to track bills, and then there's, important for today, the last thing in there is a checklist about what you might want to do if you're planning to go up to the assembly, because it can be confusing. So feel free to reference this during today's talk, take it home. If you need other copies to share, they're online. We see this as an ongoing effort, having these events to try to explain the process in Rhode Island. And we're hoping next year to do some different topics. This is our second year through the same topics. So if you have additional ideas for topics, please let Christina or I know. So now on to our program. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. The first, the furthest to your right is Hannah Stern, who is a community organizing intern with Planned Parenthood Generation Action. To her right is Ramsey Davis, who's a retired educator, a Vietnam veteran, and a member of the Rhode Island Coalition Against Gun Violence and Moms Demand Action. And finally, to his right is Emmanuel Falk, who's political director and elected organizer for District 1199 SEIU New England, which represents 4,500 healthcare and service workers in Rhode Island. So we thought we'd start a little bit by just giving them a chance to introduce themselves, and then we'll kind of dive in to some questions that I have. We'll take a little break and watch some examples of testimony that they've each given, and then finish up with some questions from the audience. So why don't we start? Emmanuel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Emmanuel Falk. I work for District 1199 SEIU, which is a healthcare union. We represent. Are you talking in the microphone? Yeah. I'm trying to. Is that better? Thank you for that feedback. District 1199 SEIU represents about, like John said, 4,500 members, mostly in healthcare. We represent almost all the workers at Women and Infants Hospital, Butler Hospital, and we represent over 1,000 workers in nursing homes. And our primary goal is to raise the standard of living for healthcare workers, working families generally, and to improve the quality of services that our members provide in the facilities that they work at.
Good morning. My name is Ramsey Davis. As John mentioned, I'm a retired teacher and Vietnam veteran, which brings a different perspective for some of these gun legislation bills. And I've worked on other efforts locally, and I live in the town of Cranston. And the one thing well, there are two things I want to tell you. One, parking. Where to park. There are a lot of recommendations for parking lots that may or may be full and may or not be available. But I would suggest, and this is what I do, and it works every time, if you walk down Smith Street, cross over Route 95, so you're heading west, take your first left, half a block down, take your first right. That's Jewett Street. It's Jewett. It's well lit. There's always parking on it. Even the other night when we had to wait 45 minutes to get into the State House, there was parking on Jewett Street. So, and the main thing that I wanted to get across is that I found, for me, the most important thing was when you find the item that you want to testify on, the cause that's important to you, take the time way before the legislative sessions. Find a quiet room, a quiet place with nothing to distract you, and force you, this works for me, just force yourself to think about what is the motivation that's driving you for that cause. There's so many great causes out there. Why is this one hooking you? What is it that's important about it? And really think about that, because that's what's going to be the driving force for you when you're up there testifying and when you're preparing and you're doing the things that you have to do to get ready for this. Thank you.
Thank you. And Hannah?
Oh, no. There we go. Hi, my name is Hannah Stern, and as said before, I'm an organizing intern with Planned Parenthood Generation Action. But I've also worked with several women's rights and reproductive justice advocacy groups, not only in Rhode Island, but in Idaho and in California. So I've had some organizing and advocacy work and experience testifying in a few different states, but I'm really happy to be in Rhode Island and really happy to be here today. So thank you very much. And also, I should probably say that I generally focus on reproductive justice issues and women's rights. And right now, the causes that I'm working around especially are abortion rights. Some of you might be familiar with the Rhode Island Reproductive Health Care Act that's been introduced. And I also am right now working with feminine hygiene and homelessness. So you'll see that kind of reflected in the tampon tax testimony that they'll be showing. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So we found out where to park, which is always, in a weird way, something that deters people from showing up at the State House. I've had lots of people say, when you encourage them to come, they say, well, where do you park? And so, yeah, there are many options. It's not that hard. Another is to park at the mall and walk up the hill. But I'll start with Hannah. So when you've testified and you've found your parking spot, and you go in that big imposing building, where do you go? How did you find out where you needed to go?
So I think probably one of the more important things to realize is that all of the bills are heard by different committees depending on what the content of the bill is. So if you're going to a hearing, you'll want to make sure which committee room it's being held in. The map that's in your packet is going to be extremely useful for that. I've never testified in front of the whole assembly, which doesn't necessarily happen. And you'll always want to go to the committee room where the bill's being heard.
So, so the testimony occurs before these committees. There's about a little less than a dozen per chamber, and they're divided up roughly into kind of mutually exclusive categories. So what committees have you testified in front of?
In Idaho, I testified in front of the Health and Welfare Committee. Here, I've just testified in front of the House Finance Committee, which, again, the tampon tax testimony that I've done, that's up on the screen right now, that was in front of the House Finance Committee.
So Ramsey, when you get and find the room, can you talk a little bit, and I know this is very basic, but it can cause people questions. I see it every time I'm up there, people kind of wandering around trying to figure things out. So we're going to start with the basics. So where do you sign up? And do you have to if you sign up?
Well, certainly arrive ahead of time. There'll typically be a sign up sheets outside the committee room. You want to sign up on those sheets. You will indicate on those sheets if you want to testify or not. Sometimes they have a second running list of just the people who want to testify. You really need to ask. There are typically a couple of people behind the desk. You want to ask them what's going on. I've seen different approaches to this. The other night, what you're going to see on the screen, that testimony went till 2:15 in the morning. At one point, my name was on the list at 2 o'clock. I was there from 2 until 1:30. So my name was on a list. However, the wee hours of the morning, another list was constructed, and they were ignoring the first list. So you really need to keep in touch with the pages that are walking around. You'll see pages coming in and out of the whatever room the testimony is being held in. Often you can't get into the room. You have to wait until it's your turn to testify. So you need to keep your ears open and figure out where that list is. So what I found out the other night was you need to stand outside the door and indicate to the page, yes, you are going to testify. Yes, you are on the list to testify. Once you get into the room, the page came over and handed me the new list. So then I see I'm way down that list, although I was toward the top of the first list. So you really have to pay attention. Bring, for the Senate, well, I would say at least 10 copies for the Senate, 25 for the House. More if you would like to pass them out. If it's formalized enough to pass to the press, bring extras to pass them out to the press. Indicate your name and address, so if they need to email, if they need to contact you, they can. Sometimes they want to verify things. Was there a third part to that question?
Do you have to give written testimony?
No, you can go and observe if the room isn't full. You don't need to indicate, you don't have to give written testimony. And if you sign up for written testimony and it's too late and you need to leave, you leave, and they just bypass you.
So you can sign up just to show support and write, I don't want to testify, and they'll respect that. And some committees will actually read the names of the people who do that. Mm-hmm. You can sign up to testify. You can sign up to testify and hand in written testimony, or you can just hand in written testimony and not testify. So there are a lot of options to participate. So if you have anxiety about public speaking and you don't want to speak in public, you can still make your voice heard by signing up, not to testify or handing in written testimony. So one of the things, Emmanuel, that I found interesting when I started doing this myself is that sometimes they actually vote on the bill before they start taking testimony. So can you explain what they're doing?
Yeah, so it's pretty much every bill hearing, the chairwoman or the chairman of the committee will take a motion, and every bill that they're hearing that day, they'll take a motion to vote for further study. So they'll take the testimony and then usually behind closed doors or in a committee caucus or in consultation with the Senate president or a speaker's office, they will recommit the bills that they're seriously considering, and then they'll actually vote on that bill if it's going to move later in the process. So pretty much every hearing you're going to go to, right at the beginning, they're going to vote to hold all the bills for further study, and that doesn't mean your bill's dead. It just means they're gonna take their time with it.
And one of the reasons they do that is if they lose a quorum, technically they can't continue to have a hearing and then hold the vote afterward. So they do that at the beginning while they still have a quorum. One of the, I'll editorialize for a minute, one of the reasons they leave is they often have fundraisers those nights, and so people will go off to their fundraiser and only a couple members of the committee will remain listening to testimony. It was impressive, though, the other night when you watch Ramsey's testimony at 1:30 in the morning. Most of the committee, almost the whole committee, was still there. So they deserve a lot.
And paying attention.
And paying attention, asking questions.
Yeah.
So
Can I just give one little hint? If you are going to testify and you think you're running behind, someone else can sign you up. And usually, if you're there testifying on behalf of an organization, they can sign you up. That way, you're not all the way at the bottom, and anyone can sign you up. If you don't show up, they get upset. But that's just one little hint if you're running a little behind.
yeah, that's a great point. And oftentimes the order that people sign up can get a little strategic. So on a big, huge bill like the gun bills, they'll take pro and con and go back and forth. If it's a smaller bill and there's only 5 people, say, you might decide, hey, I want to go first, right? I want to kind of lay out, what's happening and what's important about this bill. Or you may know that you have a sort of the person opposing your position on the bill, you might want to go after them to counter their arguments. Or if you're coordinating with somebody, you might want to have one of you go first and one of you go last. And so you can actually, and I do this, I'll sign up and leave some spaces above my name. Oftentimes the ACLU and Common Cause will go back and forth on things. And I'll know his arguments from years past, and so particularly on campaign finance bills. And I'll sign up a little after Steve and let Steve go a little earlier so I can rebut his arguments. So Hannah, roughly how long was your testimony? Do you typically read your testimony?
I always bring a written copy with me. I think that even if you think you've memorized it, once you are actually speaking in front of the committee, you'll find that you have memorized almost nothing. I always bring a written testimony because of that, and I usually try to reference it. So I usually try to maintain eye contact most of the time when I'm speaking to the committee, and then reference my testimony. I usually try to keep it under 3 minutes. I think that kind of the sweet spot for testimonies is between 2 minutes and 3 minutes. I think generally all of the points that you're trying to make can be made very succinctly and powerfully within that time frame, and that also allows for time for you to pause and speak at the tempo that you want to be speaking and make sure that the words that you want to emphasize and the points that you want to emphasize are really being emphasized. So I would definitely encourage people to try to keep their testimony under 3 minutes. I think that there are some committees, especially in Idaho, they were very, very strict about the timelines. Like, they would literally cut you off in the middle and be like, your time's up. So I think that's probably about the time that I would recommend.
Emmanuel, so you're a professional lobbyist, like myself.
Thank you.
Sorry, not in the pejorative sense, but when it's a big initiative of yours, do you always stick to or do you feel you can go a little longer because you're the expert and you might have some of your members who are kind of giving a more testimonial type of.
Yeah, even in that situation, I usually won't go much longer than two or 3 minutes. Some organizations will fly in experts, and usually the chairman or chairwoman will give them more latitude in going longer if they're getting into real technical stuff. But as much as possible on our really top priorities, we try to have our members testify and have them keep it to two or 3 minutes as well.
Do you talk to them about, so when you have members and you're encouraging them, do you provide them advice and help them prepare their testimony?
Yeah, I think we touched on most of it. Like, you don't want to we prep our members not to just read the testimony. Generally, we want them to talk about the actual work they do. The work that they do is really very well respected. So last year, we had a bunch of CNAs working to earn a increase in the Medicaid reimbursement so that their wages would go up. And so when I prep them, I tell them to talk very specifically about the work they do and how hard it is with the staffing challenges, because they are way more relatable than I am, because most of the members of the General Assembly, they have parents in a nursing home or have been in a nursing home, and they're really well regarded. So I just tell them, don't read it, keep it to 2 minutes, and talk about anecdotes. And even if they make people a little uncomfortable, like toileting seniors, and I think it's really important because there's a lot of blah, blah, blah up there, and as much as you can highlight and make it more real life, whether it's pleasant or not, people like our members will get more attention, and it has more weight.
Ramsey, you've mentioned you live in Cranston, and I know you've testified in front of the Cranston City Council. And is that any different than the Assembly, or is it roughly the same sort of thing, testifying in front of a city council?
They're all different. I've been in school committees and city councils and subcommittees, and everyone is different, and they're all very. I would suggest you be somewhere further down the line in terms of testifying and get a sense if they're going to cut you off or not. I find at the state level, they tend to not cut you off. I had one the other night, we were there so late, this one fellow spoke. Halfway into his speech, I started counting, well, I got to 100, and I stopped counting. So avoid that, obviously. But yeah, they're very different. Get a sense for how long you're going to be able to speak, but I try to keep it 3 or 4 minutes.
That's good advice. So what we thought we would do is watch each of our panelists give some testimony up at the State House, and then have them talk a little bit about what they did there. So the first person is Hannah, and as Emmanuel just said, sometimes people talk about uncomfortable topics. There's some giggling and laughter if you've watched the whole hearing, because this is on a bill to lift the sales tax on feminine hygiene products. So a mostly male committee got the case of the giggles. So, Mike, thanks.
Good evening, Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you very much for your time this evening. My name is Hannah Stern, and I'm a constituent of Providence in support of 5377, or H5377. According to a 2015 Huffington Post article, women have an average of 456 menstrual periods over the course of their entire lives. When we dissect this further, the average woman will spend over 6 years of her life menstruating. The issue of eliminating sales tax on feminine hygiene products is a clearly gender-specific economic issue. Health and hygiene products should not, under financial law, target a specific gender or group of citizens to generate revenue for the state. It is no surprise that having a period is an extra expense for a woman. And the same Huffington Post article calculates that over the course of a woman's lifetime, she will spend an average of $1,773 on tampons. If a woman chooses to use pads or a combination of hygiene products, she will spend an average of $443 on pads and liners. These are not luxury products. These are products necessary for comfort and hygiene during a healthy and natural process in a woman's body. These are also products that must be continually purchased for years on end. Even though that might not seem like a huge expense if you're calculating over the course of a lifetime, hygiene products are not the sole expense of menstruation. Many women, including myself, rely on the use of medication and additional products to curb the effects of menstruating. I consistently use pain medication and a monthly hormonal birth control prescription that tempers the effects of my period, in addition to multiple hygiene products. Medication, especially in conjunction with expensive hygiene products, is not cheap. Personally, I've spent upwards of $30 a month on medication that simply lessens the effect of menstruating and allows me to continue working and completing my daily responsibilities. Over the course of my lifetime, this has the potential to add up to over $13,000. in addition to the substantial amount of money already being spent on hygiene products. When we implore you to eliminate sales tax on items that are necessary for women, we ask you to consider the economic impact of being a woman throughout our entire lives. Pads and tampons are not the singular products that a woman depends on during her menstruation cycle, and eliminating some of the financial burden on a woman to take care of her health and hygiene is a crucial step towards lessening the significant monetary impact of simply existing as a woman. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
So we didn't see the giggles, but there were some giggles at other parts. Hannah, that was highly personal testimony, but also very detailed in terms of the numbers. How did you go about preparing for that?
I think that especially when you are testifying for bills that are clearly personally impactful, I think that it's really helpful to not only rely on statistics and different numbers that assist what you're trying to explain or argue for, but it also helps to tie that back into your personal lived-in experience. I think that it's really important to realize that when you are testifying for a bill, there's always a personally important reason that you're there and that you are standing up for this issue, and to tap into that, and then also realize that you're not the only person who's experiencing whatever you're trying to argue for, and how you can tie that back into the general lived experience of everyone that's impacted by the bill.
Did you get good feedback on that? I know you got some press coverage.
Yeah. Yeah, we were, myself and then Christina, who is also part of Common Cause, we were both quoted in the Providence Daily Journal. Afterwards, they took quotes from our testimony. And from my testimony, they took the story, or the part where I was talking about how much money I personally spend, not only just on feminine hygiene products, but on other things that I have to use, like medication, that just kind of lessens the impact of this process on my body and makes it so that I can go to work. And I think that that's also really important to point out issues that may not seem immediately related to the bill that you're testifying about, but you can connect it back and show that there's kind of this whole web of issues that makes this particular bill or issue important.
Great. Well, thank you for letting us
Yeah,
show
thank
that. I
you.
know it's a little, seeing yourself up on the big screen there. So the next one we have is Emmanuel. Do you want to explain, you explained a little bit about what this bill was about, but you had some CNEs testify right before you, and you were kind of batting cleanup, it seemed.
Yeah, we usually have our members go ahead of us and kind of back clean up, because the story is more interesting, and then we'll throw in a few technical details. The testimony I think that's going to be shown is, again, we were specifically trying to, there was a scheduled increase to the nursing home budget in the Medicaid budget process, and we were trying to win what's called a wage pass-through, and we were asking that 90% of that increase went to frontline workers, because the current CNA at that time was making $13.14 an hour, which is pitiful. And some of the CNAs who testified sort of set it up. We had one CNA who basically said, I was an assistant manager at Dunkin' Donuts 8 years ago, and if I had stayed there, I'd be making as much there as I'm making today, taking care of elderly and folks with disabilities. So that was kind of the issue we were working on, and we actually won. So I guess I should have waited to say that after you watched the testimony.
So, Mike, can we?
For further study, please.
Certainly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. To answer your question, I'm Emmanuel Falk with SEIU. To answer your question, Representative Gianrusso, the amount is equals the proposed cut to the Nursing Home Inflationary Index, which is also called the COLA. So for 10 years, there's been cuts. This year, we're asking for level funding, and that some money be directed for the frontline caregivers. That the there's not just a blank check, but that we make sure funding is going into the pockets of the people that talked today, the folks that work in a nursing home, and with Grace, they're around excrement, loneliness, and ultimately death every day, and we need to give them a raise. Massachusetts, the legislation is modeled on what Massachusetts did last year, and there is actually in Charlie Baker, in Governor Baker's proposed budget, there's another $30 million investment that is likely to pass. So when we talk about Mass already pays better, so as they continue to invest, as some of the CNAs mentioned, they're going to be making more and more up there, and most people in Rhode Island are about 25 minutes from the Mass border, so it is going to be a workforce issue. There is a precedent in Rhode Island of doing something similar. In 2000, there was a staffing shortage in nursing homes, and the House, as part of the budget, included wage pass-through, similar to what we are proposing. So we're urging folks to do again, to be proactive so we don't have a staffing crisis instead of responding like we did in 2000 to a staffing crisis. There is a new poll out. I included it in your packet. It's funding and associate polls. 76% of Rhode Islanders support a $15 minimum wage for direct care nursing home workers. It's part of a growing movement. California, New York, 5,000 CNAs, and Pennsylvania just got a starting rate of $15. We hope that this bill gets us on a path to doing that. It won't do it overnight, but we need to start catching up with our neighbors and the rest of the country. Even Texas has adopted a similar bill, so this is not just a blue state sort of proposal. And with that, I'll take any questions that folks have.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Flynn?
Yes.
Thank you, Chairman Gallison and members of the committee, and thanks,
Mike? Yep, great, thanks. And that's your boss, right?
That's my boss,
Yeah,
Patrick.
so you didn't do cleanup. Your boss really was the cleanup
Right.
better.
I had third, I guess.
There. It would, because it's Rhode Island, I have to point out that the chairman of the committee is now in federal prison.
Yes.
So this was, I think, literally days before he resigned from office, if I'm correct.
Yeah, it was about probably 10 days.
Yeah,
2 weeks,
so,
yeah.
so you never know in Rhode Island.
He was a little more agitated that day than he usually is.
So, but you started out by answering a question. So I can't remember. I think the question was posed to one of your members who might not have been able to answer it. And do you get a lot of questions?
Not generally. There's not generally a ton of questions, but if you go earlier, they tend to ask more questions in the beginning, and then as the night drags on, they ask less questions.
But as the professional, you kind of felt you were able to answer the question when maybe one of your CNAs couldn't answer the more technical.
Right, and we coach our members. If you can't answer a question, don't just make it up. We can get back to them, or I can explain it to them, or whoever's doing cleanup.
Yeah. So I thought that was, I think it's good to have the contrast between the professional who, and then the person who's kind of given the more testimonial from their own personal experience. I think we're going to go back a little more to the testimonial here with Ramsey. Can you set this up for us? What was this? You said this was earlier this week at 1:30 in the morning.
Yes, this had to do with, there were a series of gun legislation right now. I think about 9 of them, and most of which our organizations that I'm a member of are in support of. But there were 3 primary bills that we're strongly supporting. They will often ask you to only testify on one bill, but so many people, because there were so many related bills up there, many of the people were testifying on multiple bills, and there did not seem to be any objection to that. And when I introduced, I mentioned the 3 bills. I started by just I was going to do 1 bill, but then when I heard everybody else, I put the numbers of the other 2 bills that I wanted to, because I saw that that was accepted. So you'll find that you'll be modifying what you're going to say. The sheets that I used, the written testimony that I was using, was greatly modified by the time I got up there to speak, because I was trying to refute some things, and I was adding some things. You'll note an ad lib section in here. I think it's obvious, but I'm looking up the entire time and explaining an incident that happened to me personally as a teacher, having to do with a concealed carry weapon in a classroom situation. And I added that evening because after listening to the testimony, I felt this was an important aspect that needed to be heard. I've used it at the local level in Cranston for similar legislation, but I hadn't used it here. And also, I just want to mention, in terms of props, I think sometimes props are important. Last year, in front of the same committee, I walked into the room with my camouflage jacket that I actually wore in Vietnam. It was the last one I brought home. I think that was the only thing I brought home. But I wore that into the room, and I had something over that. I took that off, and then I went up to sit down. So people obviously thought that I was speaking pro-gun. But I started, after I gave my introduction, Vietnam veteran, la-di-da, I then took off that shirt, that camouflage top, and I had my yellow coalition t-shirt on under that. So I think it's important to try to use props if they're appropriate. I've done other things like that in the past. I think it's important to have a closing appeal, and I think I did that in this case, you'll see, I hope.
Well, you had me worried when you said you used props and it was gun legislation. So I was glad it was just a jacket. But why don't we watch the last clip here?
To Representative Scott.
Oops. I might not have
Good
had it.
evening and welcome.
Yep, here we go.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you all. I appreciate your time and your attention. It's quite amazing. My name is Ramsey Davis. I'm a resident of Cranston. I've lived in Rhode Island since the 1970s. I'm speaking in support of Senate Bills 2493, 2319, and 2289, and I timed this in under 4 minutes, so hopefully I can beat that. I served in the U.S. Marine Corps as an infantry radio man and an interpreter in Vietnam. During one of my very first experiences in combat, our platoon was pinned down for hours by North Vietnamese snipers. Every time a single shot was fired, a Marine lay dead. Our corpsmen and many other comrades were killed that day because of a military assault weapon. Although the rifle had the capacity to fire as an automatic weapon, only single shots ran out with deadly effect. This same style weapon is available today for an 18-year-old to purchase in Rhode Island. Banning military assault style weapons, as in our neighboring states, is not enough. This was attempted in 1994 at the federal level. The gun manufacturers skirted the ban by modifying the weapons to meet the regulations and produce more semi-automatic military assault style weapons. The manufacturers are able to bob and weave their way around the regulations. You've heard that a number of times tonight. The Providence Journal recently published a list of close to 100 military assault style weapons available in Rhode Island. Machine guns, bazookas, flamethrowers, and grenade launchers are banned. Why not assault weapons, as in our adjoining states? Mark Patenkin had an article in the Sunday paper last week you might have read. He went to a shooting range. That's great. So allow assault weapons at shooting ranges, and folks can experience that if they want to. As an infantryman under enemy fire, the moment of greatest anxiety was the necessity to change my rifle's magazine. Not only was there the element of time, but the knowledge that this is when the weapon was more likely to jam. So it takes 3 or 4 seconds to change the magazine, but every time I went to change that magazine, there was terror in my mind that that thing wasn't going to work again. Limiting the number of rounds in a magazine to 10 or less is essential. The removal and changing of a magazine is a moment of pause and possible jamming of the weapon that gives potential victims an opportunity to neutralize the shooter. Duck hunters are limited to 3 rounds. Why should a terrorist have access to 50-round magazines while hunting people? It is time for the privileges of the minority to be modified rather than the rights and safety of the masses. Please ban military assault-style weapons and place a limit on the number of rounds in a magazine. I have been a teacher for 31 years as well, and our only grandchild starts kindergarten in September. I personally know we don't need more guns in schools other than by police and peace officers. If more guns were the solution, then America would be a much safer country, or would be the safest country in the world. America has 270 million firearms. We represent 4.4% of the world's population, and yet we have 44% of the weapons that exist in the world. That's almost half the weapons in the world. I experienced as a teacher years ago an incident with a handgun that was pulled out in my presence and the presence of a student of mine. That individual had a concealed carry permit, and he was able to do that. This fellow pulled myself, I was out of Vietnam 10 or 15 years, pulled myself and the student into his office, closed the door, pulled a .45 out of his drawer and started waving it around in a threatening manner because he thought he could make a point with his student who was having difficulties in the school. He was a concealed carry permit holder. Now there's a perfect example of many why we do not need more guns in our schools. I know there's a closing here. Please, folks, consider these bills for the safety of my only grandchild and the thousands of other students in this great state of ours. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions or?
Great, thanks. So I just want to say I was there that night. I did not stay all the night. I had a bill on another topic, and I waited 45 minutes to get in the front door. It's my 10th legislative session. I have never waited 45 minutes to get in the front door. There were, by some estimates, 4,000 people showed up. I've seen estimates vary from about 2,000 to 4,000 people. So that was the most remarkable night I've ever seen at the assembly. So good for you for staying till 1:30 in the morning, because not a lot of people would. But you made the point, and actually Emmanuel made the point. You both talked about neighboring states. And I just want to ask why you thought it was important to make the point about neighboring states.
Well, I suppose because, and I could have actually, if it weren't 1:30 in the morning, I might have been there were some other really stronger points that could have been made, but I think it's essential that we point out how we differ from how we are the similar and how we differ from our adjoining states. And if I had more time, I could have, elaborated on that, but I think that tends to hopefully sway the legislators to think about, well, if they're doing it, why aren't we doing it?
Emmanuel, did you even mentioned sort of, it seems like a different problem, which is we're so close they could poach our workers.
Yeah, there's always an interest from people up there, the reps, senators, what Massachusetts especially is doing, because they're right next door, and 80% of our population is a 20-minute drive to Massachusetts. So they're always interested in exactly what Massachusetts is doing on that issue, and they tend not to want to be an outlier compared to Massachusetts and Connecticut and our neighboring states. So if it gets done there's a much better chance of getting it done in Rhode Island. I don't know if that's part of our inferiority complex, Napoleonic complex, whatever, but they want to know what Massachusetts especially is doing.
Yeah, and I find they don't necessarily want to be ahead of Massachusetts. sometimes. So if you're behind Massachusetts, or you're with parity in Massachusetts, they don't want to take the next step first. But Ramsey, is there anything else you wanted to point out about your testimony now that you've had a chance to watch it? I assume that's probably the first time you've seen it since you did that. I was before that committee the next night, and they were just about falling asleep. The chair kept apologizing because she was yawning during the hearing. Why'd you stay? I mean, I am just fascinated by people who stay up there all night to do this.
Well, we were obviously outnumbered 10 or 15 to 1, I think. I think we really have them worried this time. They're really concerned that they're going to lose some rights that they feel they should have. I just felt that there were, as I say, we were outnumbered quite a bit, and I put a lot of time and effort into preparing this. I felt it was important that it get presented, and fortunately I'm semi-retired, so I could sleep a little later in the morning. I did want to mention, I think it's important to do a follow-up letter. If you can, I mean, it's easy enough to do an email, but if you can sit down and write a follow-up note to them, and if appropriate, include a document, if there's some supporting document, which I happen to have something that I can, that I will send them. I think that they do tend to pay attention, and they were awake. I mean, at 1:30, they were really appeared to be paying attention very closely. I was impressed with that, to see that at working.
Yeah, I think that's a good point on the follow-up. I think if they hear from you in multiple ways, so we have some postcards you were asked to sign on early voting. This bill's been in for years. The chair of that committee, I had a meeting with her, and she said, I have a stack of your postcards sitting on my kitchen counter. They do pay attention to their mail, I find. So it can be helpful to do these things. So Hannah, do you want to talk about sort of how you, we've talked a little bit about how you, write your testimony and what what your, I guess, creative process is for that?
Yeah. Usually when I start writing testimony, I never write like a full first draft. I usually write down all of the points that I think are really important to make and that I want to be sure that I present. And then I'll try to use those and kind of structure it out of that. I kind of go about it two ways. Usually I'll either start broad and end personal, or I'll do the exact opposite and start personal and then expand that out. To me, it really just depends on the topic that I'm talking about and whether I feel like the personal experience that I'm speaking about is better as kind of a closing argument, or if it works to set the tone for what I'm talking about. For instance, I guess in the testimony that you saw, I talk about myself at the very end, which I think is important because when you're bringing up numbers and statistics, it helps to then draw it back to, and also this applies to the person sitting in front of you, talking to you right now. So I would say that's probably my process. I start by putting out all of the points that I want to make, and then I fill it in from there with more support, and then I kind of determine where like my personal anecdote and the connection that I have to the issue fits in best and how I feel it will be most powerfully represented.
Thanks. Ramsey, do you sort of the same thing? Do you have a method for when you're preparing your testimony? I mean, you talked about sort of going into a room and thinking about why you're doing this, but do you tailor it to the particular, was your city council testimony different because it was a city council? Short of the fact that it was probably a different bill?
Well, it was similar bill, yes. What I do is I have a pad of paper and I leave that out the weeks before, and I just, as things pop into my mind, I put it on that pad of paper because I know if I don't write it down, it's gone. And I just reflect back on that, and events during the day and conversations and what you read, I tend to pull those things in and I'll make a note. I've got a stack of gun legislation articles that I keep and highlight, and I also, keep a running list of quotes and statistics on one document. And it goes on for pages because I've extracted it from all different sources. So I'll reach back to that, and it rekindles the memory and brings up other ideas about. My testimony, I'll vary it depending upon obviously the audience.
Great. Manuel, do you have a method?
Keep it to a page. That's usually how I do it. You got to remember, most of the legislators up there have full-time jobs. They have no staff that does the vetting of this unless they're in a leadership position. So I try to keep to one page and strategically bold the key points I wanna make. And it's always good to attach a colorful chart on the other side. But that's pretty much, I don't know if that's a method, but that's usually what gets their attention, and you can refer to it during your testimony too.
Yeah, and you keep those, my experience, you keep the charts simple. Sometimes you see people with volumes of material, and then they start saying, well, on the 33rd page, the second cell down from, and they have a stack, particularly if it's a controversial bill, of things, and they don't necessarily want to sort through too much. So I've run through my questions. Why don't we, if anybody has questions from the audience, if you can direct them to me, and then I'll repeat them for the microphone so the camera captures it. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
It just because you're sitting next to each other and followed each other about the tampon tax, and you spoke about guns. Are guns taxed? Do we generate revenue in this state from gun ownership on a monthly basis?
Yeah, so
Well,
the question
sales tax.
Yeah, the question is, are guns taxed?
Well, I obviously there's a sales tax for the guns and the ammunition. I don't know of any other. Do you know of any other taxes for them? No, I don't think so. I mean, there's been proposals about licensing guns and putting a tax on those. There's also been proposals about requiring insurance, that if you're a gun owner, then you should have insurance on that weapon. There have been some other proposals, but I don't know of anything other than the sales tax.
Yeah, and they're exempted from product liability, I believe, by federal law. So a gun manufacturer can't be sued the way Poland Spring could be sued if there was a bad bottle of water, if there's a bad gun. I don't think they're subject to product liability, but yes.
Excuse me, thinking about the order of sign-up, which is very strategic, and that makes a lot of sense. And granted, the day of the gun bill, the numbers were just out of this world. But are you suggesting, Ramsey, that you said at first you're at the top of the list, and you found were they jiggering the list, or they just were so overwhelmed that somehow you ended up?
Well, there were two lists. Yes, there was the initial list, sign-up list that was filled in at 2 o'clock outside the room, but then at 10:30 or 11, I guess they found that overwhelming, and the page was wandering around encouraging people to get in line outside the door if they were going to testify. And once you got inside the door, there was another list that you were handed, and then you filled that in. I think that's unusual. I've never experienced that before. But I'm just saying, keep an eye out. Things do change up there. And I find inconsistencies from every place that I've testified, that the procedures are different. You just have to ask.
Sorry, just to finish my question, but for people who have limited time and really want to testify on a smaller, more manageable bill, can you kind of count on that order? Has that been your experience if it's, not thousands of people signing?
Typically, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I would add a couple points. One is, this is an extraordinary circumstance. You're not going to be there on a routine bill till 1:30 in the morning. They typically go in the order that you sign up to testify, but they don't take the bills in the order on which they're on the agenda. And you would think they would, but for a number of reasons, one of which is many members sit on multiple committees, and so the sponsor usually introduces the bill. They'll usually take a bill from somebody who's on another committee first so they can get out of the room, and so forth. So know that if you're the first bill, you might not be going first, your bill. This is flummoxed me for many, many years, explaining to my wife, I don't know when I'm going to be home tonight, because, you know, I may be at the top of the agenda, but I end up at the bottom of the agenda. Did you have a point to make about that, or?
I would just, there is jiggering of the list, not all the time. Generally, they start at the top and work their way down, but if there's a powerful lobbyist working on that bill, they'll get there. They'll sometimes talk to the chairperson, depending on who the chair is. Not all of them will grant that request from the power lobbyist. Some of them will, and their clients will testify first, just to be realistic about it. And then sometimes, and I think this is actually a good thing, if there's outside experts that have been flown in on certain bills, they'll have them, you can make a request that they go first, and they go first. And I know Aaron Regenberg, who's a rep up there, is trying to change the process, but it depends on who the chair is, but there's a lot of jiggering of the list.
And you have to be your own advocate. So if you, if they say that's the end of the testimony and they didn't call you, but you signed up, you can stand up, you know, in a polite way and say, I thought I signed up. And 9 times out of 10, they'll let you come up and testify. So be your own advocate up there. You're not going to get yelled at for asking a question of the staff. You will, one point we didn't make out, because none of you did it, is never ask the committee a question. I have gotten slapped down for this. Oftentimes they'll ask you a question and your impulse will be to ask them a question in return, and you don't do that. And you can get slapped down. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a follow-up question to the question.
Yeah.
So what is your personal advice? I have been going to testimonies, and again, my first response to what the people say before me when I speak is like formulating other questions or having the data to answer questions that were asked. So how powerful do you think it is to use some of your 3 minutes time to answer or to make connections to questions that were asked? Or if you have good answers, do you go with a good answer first like you did, or do you save all your time for your own testimony? What is the best way to go? What have you seen in your experience?
Yeah, so I'll try to summarize it. So the question's about if you see questions being asked before you go, do you address those questions or do you just stick to your testimony?
I would answer the questions that they gave, that if you don't think the previous person that testified answered the question well, or you think they answered it incorrectly, especially if they're on the other side, I would, you know, in a polite way, Representative X, just to follow up on your question. And then I would get into your testimony, especially if you're not one of the first few, because your testimony probably is going to be similar at that point. But if you can jump in and give an enhanced answer to a question, I would totally start your testimony that way.
And if you don't have it at hand, I think Ramsey's advice about the letter is good. So I'll send a letter to the committee with whatever fact that, you know, once I go and retrieve the fact. I try not to, you know, if I don't know it for sure, but I'm pretty sure, I'll say, I think I know the answer. I'll send you a letter following up on that and make sure you do that. Either Hannah or Ramsey have an answer to that, or does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
A question for Hannah. I noticed at the beginning of your testimony, you identified yourself as a constituent from Providence, but you did not mention your affiliation with an organization. Was that purposeful, or is that the way it's typically done?
So I never have testified on behalf of an organization, and it's very purposeful for me to identify as a citizen as opposed to part of an organization, and that's mostly just because as a citizen who volunteers for organizations, that I guess basically you just don't want to speak on behalf of an organization when you're a volunteer for them. That's typically just the model that I follow. Unless you're explicitly asked to provide like your link with that or affiliation with that organization. So I have never testified on behalf of an organization. I always testify as a citizen. And yeah, I think I would just, yeah.
I think, I won't jump in, but I think that you avoid being tagged as a lobbyist.
Exactly.
A lobbyist and having to register. So
Yeah.
I think that you can get away with that a certain number of times. If they see you there, then they know something's up.
Yeah, I think it's, oh, sorry. I think it's also just really impactful to identify as a citizen. I think that a lot of times it matters that there are citizens who are fighting for really important issues. And I think I generally would rather identify as a voter than as a volunteer for an organization.
And some organizations do, though, like, so
Yeah.
the, 1199, you had your constituents, or your members, testify as 1199 members. We, from time to time, do have people who identify as Common Cause members testify, not just staff. And I'll say, as a little bit of a control freak, if you're gonna try to do that, make sure they know that, tell the organization. They might wanna read your testimony and make sure it's factually correct. And to David's point, even if you're saying I'm a member of Common Cause and I'm here to testify on this bill, that doesn't make you a lobbyist, right? The person who's the lobbyist is the person who's getting paid to be there. It used to be that there was a rule that if you testified more than 2 times on something, you might have to register as a lobbyist. That it no longer exists. If you can be a member of millions of groups and say you're a member of millions of groups, but you're not their lobbyist unless you're getting paid by them. And it's not just paid, it has to be a substantial portion of what you do on their behalf. So you could have the CEO of a company come in, testify, but they testify once. They're not the lobbyist for the entity. Other questions? Yes, we'll be right behind you, David. Sorry. You sure? Okay.
Well, this is kind of changing the subject. I wanted to ask you if early voting has been heard yet, and if any of the opponents have brought up the, what's his name, Geoforti case in Montana, where the candidate for Congress punched a reporter.
Mhm.
I think was it the evening before
Yep.
the vote? And some early voters wanted to change their vote, but they couldn't. So how would you respond to that?
Sure. So the early voting bill has its first hearing Wednesday in the House Judiciary Committee, so you're all welcome to come, room 205. I have gotten that, right? So people bring that case up, and there's some other instances. The answer is, I think, twofold. One is that what if he had punched the reporter the day after the election, right? So you can't control the events. Yes, had people voted for him and they wanted to kind of change their vote, sure, they had a choice to vote early, so it's not a mandate. Everybody could still continue to vote on election day, but we want to give them the choice to vote earlier if they want to. There are some jurisdictions that will allow you to change your vote. We're not proposing that. That's kind of an administrative nightmare. But nobody would make you vote early. You would just have the choice to do it. And my other point is just, yes, things happen all the time. Sometimes they happen before elections, sometimes far ahead of an election, sometimes right before an election, sometimes after an election. So, but thank you. Well, I'm trying to spread the room. David, I'll get you. Yep. Yep.
I have a question about, so for example, one of the reasons I don't testify is because I might have political views that are different than my employers and my clients, and I'm trying to avoid stepping into murky political territory to avoid retaliation from my community and my friends and other people I work with. How do you navigate the
Yeah, I don't know if anybody, that's a good question.
I have some advice that if you're worried about, because testimonies are filmed and they're made public, if you're worried about that kind of exposure, I would just say that there are other ways to advocate for issues that are really important to you. You can always write a letter to your legislator or call them directly. That's really impactful. You don't necessarily have to testify to make a difference or make your voice heard. And if that's something you're worried about, I would probably just encourage you to look into other avenues that might be a little less public or might provide less exposure.
Yeah, there's a spectrum of political participation. We're focusing on one end of that spectrum, which I think is to be very involved and to take time out of your day and to go up to the State House, prepare remarks and deliver those remarks. But you know, the other end of that spectrum is, you know, voting, which is the most common form of political participation. And there's everything in between, you know, so I think that's a great answer. So, yes, sir.
It's kind of last time as well. I'm hearing from these groups, if you feel strongly about something, write a letter, don't just send an email. Is that correct? I mean, email is so easy, they can respond to you, but is a letter the way to go?
I find the letter is getting increasingly powerful. I got a 5-page response from one of my legislators on an issue. He was on the other side, but he felt it was important to support his side. The emails, you typically get an automatic response. I had sent an email to my senator about this issue, and it was interesting, the day after my testimony, I did get a reply to the email, but you know, a minute or a second after you send an email, typically you get an automatic response. So I don't really know if, you know, I'm sure it depends on the individual if they read them, but a written hand, you have to open it up. If they don't have an aide, they've got to open it up and look at it.
Yeah, and email can be auto-generated, and a lot of groups auto-generate thousands and thousands of emails, so the value of it is diminished by the ease with which it's produced. And I find the hierarchy is sort of personally reaching out to them and talking to them. And you can go up to the assembly at 4 o'clock and try to find them, and then phone call, personal correspondence, you know, and then email sort of at the bottom. It's just the easiest thing to do, but it's almost like ephemeral. So
I would do both. Like John said, the letter is definitely at the hierarchy. But if you are going to do an email, put in the subject, you're a constituent.
Yeah,
and
that's a
they'll
good,
probably read it.
good point.
And just on this subject, I sent the thank you to the people who were sponsoring the Reproductive Health Care Act, and I got 3 personal replies to that auto-generated.
Huh. So it, you know, it does work sometimes, email. One thing I found is if you get very involved, you get their other email address. So you get their personal email address, which they're more responsive to answering questions from. Yeah, ma'am.
I just wanted to ask, Ramsey, you had mentioned following up with a letter after you testified. Who do you follow up with specifically? So say you're testifying in front of the Finance Committee, are you following up with a letter and or email to the chair, to the entire committee, and then where do you find the address to respond to?
Well, the address, if you don't have their personal address, I have some personal address, and the other ones are available on the Rhode Island State website for their actual address. And I wanted to mention that with the automatic, if you send them an email using their state email address, if you're not a constituent, you have to identify on the website, you know, your zip code and your address. And if you're not their representative, it's unlikely you're going to hear anything back. But if you are, typically you will hear something back. If you do have, back to your original question, if you do have their home address, that's the best one to send it to. And I hand address it, and I put my stick-on, you know, return address up in the corner, rather than using a computer printout, which was a lot easier for me personally. But I will hand write the address on there and try and send it to their home address. And I've been the most successful in that manner.
And the Secretary of State puts out a book every 2 years called the Owner's Manual, and they're free. You can get one at the state library. So if you're up at the General Assembly, that big, beautiful Harry Potter-esque library, you can go in there and you ask for the Owner's Manual, and it has every single rep and senator, every town council person, every school board member, every judge in the state, and tons and tons of information, and their address, where they went to high school, you know, the names of their kids, everything imaginable, and that's invaluable. It usually comes out about April, the year after the election, so a new one will come out April 2019, and it can become dog-eared if you use it a lot. Christina? Yeah, so, yeah.
Oh, did you want to repeat the question? Yeah.
Yeah, so the question was, how impactful is it to thank the people who have sponsored things? Yeah, especially if it's controversial.
I think it's really important, especially in my own experience. I find that sometimes legislators not like go out on a branch, but they'll be pushing themselves to sponsor legislation that might be outside of their typical realm. And I think it's always really useful for them to hear support from their constituents and from other citizens who support what they're doing. This also kind of blends nicely into a point that I wanted to make about writing a testimony that I just remembered. You always want to be firm and polite, but never aggressive, especially because there are often legislators who are really going out and trying to make a point, and if you're testifying in front of them, you never want them to feel alienated from the point that they're supporting. So I think not only is it important to definitely thank the legislators, but it's also important in your testimony to realize that you do have advocates in the room and to not always be on the defense.
Yeah, I'll point out organizations. You'll go into some legislators' offices and they'll have bookshelves full of awards, and it's because organizations thank them by giving them an award. And so you'll see a lot of them, the AARP gives awards, Clean Water Action, everybody gives awards every year. And it's really a way to thank them for doing a lot of this stuff. Did you have a point, Emmanuel?
No, I think
Okay.
thank you cards are fine, but as our organization doesn't really do thank yous until the bills pass, generally.
So, Silent?
Just quickly, and maybe to Ramsey's point as well, what about sort of not repeating what's been said before? You touched on it a little bit, and you said, this has been said before and stuff like that, and then within a coalition, maybe the manuals with a $15 fight for $15 minimum wage, a coalition of activist groups, how do you coordinate within those? And then if it's an individual going up, how do you coordinate between individual citizens going up? Do you ever try and coordinate beforehand what you say so it's not repeated?
So repetitious testimony and then sort of coordinating as a coalition.
So the Fight for 15 coalition, which is, a lot of the same players that were in the earned sick time legislation, we had a regular coalition meeting and kind of charted out who would go first and say what. So we try to, as much as possible, avoid replicating testimony. So on the earned sick time, again, it's kind of an overlapping coalition. The coalition asked that we have workers go up, like our bus yard workers that at that point didn't have earned sick time. So we kind of provided the worker voice. So within the coalition, each organization usually finds the sweet spot on what they're supposed to say, and you kind of script. If you have a good high-functioning coalition, you will actually kind of script kind of your first 7 or 8 testifiers.
And then the repetition, Ramsey, did you have any thoughts about
Well-
that? You probably saw the same thing said quite a bit sitting through 12 hours of testimony.
Certainly, quite a few times. The Rhode Island Coalition Against Gun Violence has a organizing group, unpaid, but there are 9 or 10 individuals that I know are the organizers, and I will send a copy of my testimonial to them and ask them, you know, what do you think, and try and allow them to coordinate and take things off that somebody else might be addressing. And I also send it to the moms group as well. There are some people there that I'll send it to and get some feedback from them. But I basically leave it to the organizers, which I am not in each of those organizations, to
Great.
you know, try to sort out what might be repetitive.
Thanks, sir.
So, well, Hannah and Ramsey mentioned before getting cut off, kind of when the time's up, but have either of you have any experience with, I guess, kind of more of an aggressive response? Anybody on the council having any kind of, like, that may be on the exact opposite side of what you're arguing and be more aggressive in their questioning of what you're proposing, I guess?
Yeah, have you ever?
I was just wondering, like, how to respond to, like, what might be like a curt response or something.
I mean, my experience is they don't go after the citizen member, they go after the professional advocate, and I've had some nasty ones, one in particular, where a state senator literally took 20 minutes with a script and wound up and wound up and wound up to a single question he knew I couldn't answer, and then asked me to answer it, to just for the sole purpose of trying to embarrass me. And there's not much you can do, right? They own the microphone. You can't ask a question back. You can't get snippy with them. You just have to eat some humble pie, I guess. Do you have experience?
Yeah, I get some combative questions on ideological grounds, obviously. We think people should be getting paid a living wage, and not every rep up there. So they'll sometimes the more conservative reps or senators will razz me, but we're not gonna, I don't get combative with them, but you get it and you just kind of roll with it, and you can always say we just have a difference of opinion on this.
Yeah, the worst thing you can do is, I think, respond emotionally, because that gets them going, and then the power differential comes out at that point. Sean?
I've been able to listen to a lot of different debates about the level of engagement of a citizen and how a written letter is more valuable than a phone call and more valuable than an email. But I've actually never heard anyone discuss, and this might be just specific to Rhode Island, is there value if you're too busy or, you know, for reasons like this gentleman mentioned, you don't want to be up there, where would you place the value, or is there value in going and signing up and saying that I support or oppose this bill and then not testifying? Like, I've never heard anyone discuss where that might fall in the range, or if there is value, or if anybody knows if elected officials care about that at all.
So the question's about, you know, is there any value in going to sign up but not testify? Yeah, I think it's hard to judge. I know I'm in front of the House Judiciary Committee a lot, and the chairman there has made a point recently of reading the names of the people who signed up but aren't testifying, which is a change in practice for him. And I've got to believe there's a reason he's doing that, you know, that, you know, something changed in his mind to say, I should be doing this. I don't know if anybody.
I mean, I think there's always value in engaging with the process, and I think there's always value in identifying yourself as a citizen, either in support of or not in support of something. But yeah, it's kind of hard to quantify what the value is, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's a tally, you know, at the end of the night, if they tally the for and against, and when they do read the list, do they indicate where the person stands?
Yeah.
Oh, they do.
Yeah. I don't, to my experience, they don't necessarily tally, but Emmanuel, did you?
Yeah, I don't know the exact value. I think there's, when you have a campaign, there's value in having people in the room, even if they're not testifying, especially for the citizen testifiers, to have people literally at their back as they're facing the General Assembly. I think it's good for building momentum of your campaign to have more than 2 people testifying, even if it's people that don't testify but are there and visible. I think that's good for the energy of the momentum of the campaign you're trying to build.
Yeah, and to that point, if you have something that identifies you as what side of the issue you stand on, you know, a shirt or pins or whatever, I think that's important. Otherwise, they have no idea, we have no idea why you're there.
Yeah, so I'd see Emmanuel 3 days a week up there, and the union colors are purple. Is it purple and yellow? And so he must, I have this picture in my head of his closet at home. He opens it up, and it's just all purple shirts and ties. So, and I was going to point out when you testified, I think you were sporting the purple shirt and tie.
And I didn't wear purple today, which is pretty rare for me.
So on weekends, you're totally non-purple. Any other questions? Yes. Yes.
I wonder if you might, because most of us are citizen lobbyists, talk about beyond the actual testimony, at the rise, or 48 hours notice, or, you know, you mentioned help for further study, but there are other things that people need to know when they go up there to sort of place themselves in sub A's and sub B's so that they're not lost and confused.
Yeah, so the question is sort of what are the other sort of secret things that you need to know? The ones you raised are, there's a term at the rise. So you look on the agenda and it says the committee begins at the rise. And that means so unlike every other legislature in the country, ours meets in committee after they meet as a whole. So at the rise is when they're done meeting as a whole. That can be 10 minutes after they started meeting as a whole. It could be 6 hours later. It depends on how many agenda items they have. You can get some sense by looking at their floor calendar, their floor agenda. If there's a lot of things, the committee's not going to start right away. If there are a few things, the committee might start pretty soon after they started. And you can see all that online on their website. You can even watch video of them online. And I know people who keep the video going on their phone of the floor to see where they are, to know when they need to go to the committee. So you said at the rise.
48 hours notice. Sometimes there's very short notice that something's going to be heard, so you have to be
So
follow or have somebody in your organization follow when things are going to be heard to let everybody know when to be here.
And usually if you're a citizen and you're working with the group, they'll give you some notice of a hearing coming up. But you can sign up online. There's a bill tracking tool on the website. You punch in your name, your email, the bill number, and it will push out alerts to you when things happen. For basically from January until about mid-May, it's Friday afternoon that they post everything. They'll post the whole following week. So yesterday afternoon, they post everything they're going to do next week. As they do more at the end, those start to go out the window, and you have to pay closer attention. But for routine testimony, you'll have notice of at least about 4 days if it's Tuesday testimony, or longer if it's later in the week. So there's a lot of nuance to this, some of which we tried to cover in the last session, some of which is covered in the vocabulary and timeline portions of this. But you raise a good point, which is it can be a little mysterious. That's the title of the program, is Demystifying Democracy, because it can be mysterious to the average person who isn't engaged. You know, we're all sort of super engaged, either professionally or in our personal lives. If you're less engaged, it can be a little bit of a mystery.
It's mystifying to me sometimes too.
Yeah, and like I said,
in the last week, they actually vote to suspend the rules, and it's anything goes, and they're usually voting on sub A's, or sub B's, which are amended bills, and sometimes you're at the committee and they're literally, a clerk is handing out the changes, and then they're voting on it, and often not taking testimony, so.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that's-
you can't get a
that's-
copy of that changed bill before the vote, which can be very, very frustrating. So, and we try to give voice as an organization to some of the frustrations about how these things happen, particularly at the end of the session when they suspend the rules. If you want more of that, we're happy to answer your questions.
That seems a very Rhode Island thing to do. Is that something that occurs in other states? I mean, I know our own tradition of Rogue Island and doing things a little underhand, I know a guy kind of thing. Is that something that is unique to Rhode Island, or is it in other states?
So all states that have deadlines have a rush at the end. I'll say that sort of as a general statement. We probably rush more stuff because institutionally we don't have points along the way where things have to happen. So a lot of my colleagues in other states, they'll have a date sometime in the middle of their session when the bill will have to come out of one chamber and move over to another chamber. We don't have that. Or they'll have a real drop-dead deadline for introducing a bill. We don't. There's a deadline, but I think we've both seen bills introduced on the last day of the session. You've seen budget cuts happen literally the day they're posting the budget. So we have some of the more excessive versions of that, I'd say, in Rhode Island, but it's not unique to Rhode Island. Anybody have anything else to add on that? I hate to end on a kind of bad note. It can the good thing about Rhode Island that didn't get covered is, there was a reason 4,000 people showed up on Tuesday, which is it's so incredibly accessible geographically, right? So you can get from, unless you're in Block Island, from any point in the state to the State House in about 40 minutes. And so people can get involved, and people do get involved. I've gone to legislative hearings in other states, and it's just the lobbyists. The people don't show up. And so people can show up, and they do show up here, and that's great. And you can not just show up, but you can participate. And it's not a daunting experience once you've done it. You don't get sworn in. You're not going to get investigated by the FBI if you accidentally give a wrong fact. You can really get in the mix here, which is a great advantage that we have that other states don't.
Yeah, one of the positive things we have, and when we have our policy folks come from our national union on different issues, is we're one of the few states where you can actually just walk on the floor and talk to reps and senators. So you actually have the ability to go face-to-face to folks. It's not, in other states, you literally hang out in the lobby and the professional lobbyists know where to go, but it's no secret. If you want to find your state rep or state senator, you can go right on the floor and have any sort of a conversation you want with them.
And one thing we do is we take people around. So if you're interested in going up there and you've never been up there, we can take a group up there. We took a group of students up there recently and do just exactly what Emmanuel said, which is you go onto the floor before they start and you can walk up to them and have a conversation. So we're at the time, and I want to respect the end, so I want to thank the panelists for everything today. And I want to thank you for coming out on a Saturday and joining us. As I said, May 5th, we'll have the last installment, which will be about the state budget process. We're going to have a couple legislators, somebody from the executive branch and somebody from an outside group. And if you have any other questions, we'll be at the door on the way out, so feel free to ask. But thanks so much, and we'll put this online hopefully next week. Thank you.
Well, we'll see you at the State House.
Yeah.
Yeah.